Hello everybody, this is chapter 3 of A Story of the Vet, my new book club. So we've done chapter 1 and 2 already, and chapter 2, I asked at the end of chapter 2 I asked some questions, and these are the answers. So the questions were, what time of year is it for James the vet? And the answer is spring. Okay, springtime for James. Question number 2 was, what was the name of the little lamb without a mother? Okay, so you remember there was a little lamb running around when James was helping another ewe, and this little lamb didn't have a mother. The mother had rejected him, and he was called Herbert. Do you remember James said to the farmer, why did he call him Herbert? And the farmer said that was the name of his youngest son. And the last question was, what's the name of the farmer that had all the trouble with the lambs that year? And he was called Rob Benson. But Rob will do. Okay, well done. Hope you did all right with those questions. Okay, so now we're going to read chapter 3. Okay. And after I finish chapter 3, there'll be more questions. Okay, subject water. Okay. Them mastics, said Mr. Pickerskill, is a proper bugger. I nodded my head in agreement that his mastitis problem was indeed giving cause for concern, and thought about at the same time that while most farmers would have been content with the local word they used for this problem, which was felon, it was typical that Mr. Pickerskill should make a determined, if somewhat inaccurate attempt at the scientific term, them mastics. Sometimes he got it very badly wrong. However, he usually did better than this. Most of his efforts were near misses or bore obvious evidence of their derivation. But I could never really fathom where he got them mastics. I did know that once he'd fastened on to an expression, it never changed. Mastitis had always been them mastics with him, and it always would be. And I knew, too, that nothing would ever stop him doggedly trying to be right. Because Mr. Pickerskill had what he considered to be a scholastic background. He was a man of about 60, and when in his teens he had attended a 2-week course of instruction for agricultural workers at Leeds University. This brief glimpse of the academic life had left an indelible impression on his mind, and it was as if the intimation of something deep and true behind the facts of his everyday work had kindled a flame in him which had illuminated most of his life. No capped and gowned Don ever looked back to his years among the spires of Oxford with more nostalgia than did Mr. Pickerskill to his fortnight at Leeds, and his conversation was usually laced with references to a godlike Professor Malleson, who had apparently been in charge of the course. I don't know what to make of it, he continued. In my college days, I was allers told that you got a big swollen bag and dirty milk with them mastics. But this must be another kind. We've got just little bits of flakes in the milk off and on. Neither nowt nor something. But I'm right fed up with it, I'll tell thee. I took a sip from the cup of tea which Mrs. Pickerskill had placed in front of me on the kitchen table. Yes, it's worrying the way it just keeps going on and on. I'm sure there's a definite factor behind it all. Wish I could put my finger on it. But in fact, I had a good idea what was behind it. I had looked in at the little milking byre late one afternoon, when Mr. Pickerskill and his daughter Olive were milking their 10 cows. They did this milking by hand, and I'd watched the two of them at work as they crouched under the row of roan and redbacks, and one thing was immediately obvious. While Olive drew the milk by almost imperceptible movements of her fingers, and with a motionless wrist, her father hauled away at the teats as though he was trying to ring in the new year. This insight, coupled with the fact that it was always the cows Mr. Pickerskill milked that gave trouble, was enough to convince me that the chronic mastitis was of traumatic origin. But how to tell the farmer that he wasn't doing his job right, and that the only solution was to learn a more gentle technique, or let Olive take over all the milking? I was reluctant to affect such natural dignity that Mr. Pickerskill had. And he was fundamentally a fine stocksman. His few cows, like all the animals of that fast-dying breed of small farmer, were fat and sleek and clean. You had to look after your beasts when they were your only source of income, and somehow Mr. Pickerskill had brought up a family by milk production, eked out by selling a few pigs and the eggs from his wife's 50 hens. I could never quite work out how they did it, but they lived, and they lived graciously. All the family but Olive had married and left home, but there was still a rich decorum and harmony in that house. The present scene was typical. The farmer expounded gravely, Mrs. Pickerskill bustling about in the background, listening to him with quiet pride. Olive, too, was happy. She'd been courted for 15 years by Charlie Hudson from the Darrowby fish shop, and though Charlie was not a tempestuous suitor, there was nothing flighty about him, and he was confidently expected to pop the question over the next 10 years or so. Mr. Pickerskill offered me another buttered scone, and when I declined, he cleared his throat a few times, as though trying to find the words. "Mr. Herriot," he said at last, "I don't like to tell anybody his job, but we've tried all your remedies for them mastics, and we've still got trouble. Now, when I studied under Professor Malleson, I noted down a lot of good cures, and I'd like to try this one. Have a look at it." He put his hand in his hip pocket and produced a yellowed slip of paper, almost falling apart at the folds. "It's an udder salve. Maybe if we gave the bags a good rub with it, it'd do the trick." Suddenly the farmer groaned loudly. The action of reaching into his hip pocket had brought on a twinge of his lumbago, and he sat very upright, grimacing with pain. "Oh, this bloody old back of mine! By gore, it does give me some stick, and doctor can't do nowt about it. I've had enough pills to make me rattle, but I get no relief." Now, I'm not brilliant, but I do get the odd blinding flash, and I had one now. "Mr. Pickerskill," I said solemnly, "you've suffered from that lumbago ever since I've known you, and I've just thought of something. I believe I know how to cure it." The farmer's eyes widened and he stared at me with a childlike trust in which there was no trace of scepticism. This could be expected because just as people place more reliance on the words of knackermen and meal travellers than their vets when their animals are concerned, it was natural that they would believe the vet rather than their doctor with their own ailment. You know how to put me right, he said faintly. I think so, and it has nothing to do with medicine. You'll have to stop milking. Stop milking? What the hell? Of course. Don't you see? It's sitting crouched on that little stool night and morning every day of the week that's doing it. You're a big chap and you've got to bend to get down there. Sure, it's bad for you. Mr. Pickerskill gazed into space as though he'd seen a vision. You really think? Yes, I do. You ought to give it a try anyway. Olive can do the milking. She's always saying she ought to do it all. That's right, Dad, Olive chimed in. I like milking, you know I do. And it's time you gave it up. You've done it ever since you were a lad. Dang it, young man, I believe you're right. I'll pack it in now. I've made my decision. Mr. Pickerskill threw up his fine head, looked imperiously around him, and crashed his fist on the table as though he just concluded a merger between two oil companies. I stood up. Fine, I'll take this prescription with me and make up the adder salve. It'll be ready for you tonight, and you should start using it immediately. It was about a month later that I saw Mr. Pickerskill. He was on a bicycle, pedalling majestically across the marketplace, and he dismounted when he saw me. Now then, Mr. Herriot, he said, puffing slightly, I'm glad I've met you. I've been meaning to come and tell you that we don't have no flakes in the milk now. Ever since we started with salve, they began to disappear, and milk's as clear as it can be now. Oh, great. And how's your lumbago? Well, I'll tell you, you've really capped it, and I'm grateful. I've never milked since that day, and I hardly get a twinge now. He paused and smiled indulgently. You gave me some good advice for me back, but we had to go back to old Professor Malison to cure them mastics, didn't we? My next encounter was with Mr. Pickerskill was on the telephone. I have a calf with semolina. With semolina? I said. Aye, that's right. A fellow was on about it on wireless t'other morning. Oh, I see. I too had heard a bit of the farming talk on the salmonella infection in calves. What makes you think you got this trouble? Well, it's just like that fella on the radio said. Me calf's bleeding from the rectum. From the? Yes, of course. Well, I'd better have a further look at him. I won't be long. The calf was pretty ill when I saw him, and he did have rectal bleeding, but it wasn't like salmonella. There's no diarrhea, you see, Mr. Pickerskill, I said. In fact, he seems to be constipated. This is almost pure blood coming away from him, and he hasn't got a very high temperature. The farmer seemed a little disappointed. Dang it, I thought it was just same as that fellow was talking about. He said you could send off samples to the Labrador. To the what? The investigation Labrador, you know. Oh, yes. I don't think the laboratory would be of any help in this case. Well, what's wrong with him then? Is something the matter with his rectum? No, I said, but there does seem to be some obstruction high up in his bowel, which is causing this hemorrhage. I looked at the little animal, standing motionless with his back up. He was totally preoccupied with some internal discomfort, and now and then he strained and grunted softly. I gave Mr. Pickersgill some medicine for the calf, and I was lucky. He recovered quickly. And luckily, that was that. But Mr. Pickersgill hadn't finished with me yet. It was only a week later that I heard him on the telephone again. "Get out here quick. There's one of me pigs going bezique." Bezique? With an effort, I put away from me a mental picture of two porkers facing each other over a green baize table. "I'm afraid I don't quite—" "Aye, I gave him a dose of worm medicine, and he started jumping about and rolling on his back. I tell you he was going proper bezique." Yes, berserk. Right. Yes, I see. I'll be with you in a few minutes." The pig had quietened down a bit when I arrived, but was still in considerable pain, getting up, lying down, trotting in spurts round the pen. I gave him half a grain of morphine as a sedative, and within a few minutes he began to relax, and finally curled up in the straw. "Looks as though he's going to be all right," I said. "But what's this worm medicine you gave him?" Mr. Pickersgill produced the bottle sheepishly. "Well, this bloke was coming round selling 'em. Said it would shift any worms you cared to name." "Well, it nearly shifted your pig, didn't it?" I sniffed at the mixture, "and no wonder. It smells almost like pure turpentine." "Turpentine? Well, by gor, is that all it is? And the bloke said it was summat new. Charged me an exorbitant price for it too." I gave him back the bottle. "Well, never mind. I don't think there's any harm done, but I think the dustbin's the best place for that." As I was getting back into my car, I looked up at the farmer. "You must be about sick of the sight of me. First the mastitis, then the calf, and now your pig. You've had a bad run." Mr. Pickersgill squared his shoulders and gazed at me with massive composure. Again I was conscious of the sheer presence of the man. "Young feller," he said, "that don't bother me. Where there's stock there's trouble, and I know from experience that allers comes in cyclones." He does get his names wrong, doesn't he? It's very funny. Okay, so that was chapter 3. And the questions. What does James say to Mr. Pickersgill will cure his bad back? So if you remember at the beginning of the chapter, Mr. Pickersgill has got a really bad back. And James suggests a way of curing his bad back. Okay. Second question. What's the name of Mr. Pickersgill's daughter? Okay. And the third question. What was in that worming medicine that the man at the door gave Mr. Pickersgill? And then he gave it to his pig, and it made him very ill. So there was something in that medicine. It wasn't really medicine at all, that made the pig really ill. So what was that? Okay, so give that a go, and I'll see you for chapter 4. Okay, bye-bye for now.